Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Um, yeah, I was thinking it'd be nice to have a reoccurring, in the past, we've had reoccurring projects that the group's been working on or presentations. And I know one of our projects we've been working on is kind of an edge landscape. Is that something we want to focus in on this coming, I guess, few months, as an edge landscape, or
Um, I don't have that much personal, well, I don't know what you mean by landscape. If you mean taking that list of the Edge open source projects, yeah. Now, um, one of the members had suggested the focus rather than composing that into a landscape would be kind of classifying them, which I think is a step to the landscape anyway. In other words, right now it's just that spreadsheet, but it isn't clear, how you would break that into categories. And we had a discussion. I don't recall whether you were at that meeting or not, but one of the unfortunate things about categories, if you look at the CNCF landscape, they break things into classifications that have grown over the years. But a number of those things in the Edge spreadsheet are what I'd call integrating platforms, where they kind of cross over all over the place. They encompass networking, container scheduling, uh, service mesh, whatever, and have plugins, so that really it's difficult to put them in a single category. They go across categories, yet others are take on one job, do one thing. I think that we could address that, but it isn't, as we thought about it, it wasn't as simple as making a column in the spreadsheet, have 12 different categories and pick which one the thing falls into, because some of them fall in, some of them fall into many categories. Um, Yet there should be a way to do that. I think if you look at the CNCF landscape, the things in the that they would call orchestrators in there cross those barriers. Um, so we could take that on. Um, the other thing that came up in that discussion of what to do with it was investing more effort in getting the health metric uh, column fleshed out. And I think that was Rob Woolley who was recommending that, because the thing is, there's a couple hundred of those, and not all of them are going to be in a super healthy condition where you'd actually want to use them. So to help somebody who discover that and decide that they wanted to use, I don't know, they needed a solution in the messaging category, it would help a lot if you could give health assessments of the project so that you could organize your efforts to spend time looking up the project and maybe doing prototypes and evaluating them. Um, there is that Linux Foundation sponsored health metric program. Um, Maybe 6 or 10 of them actually have formally enlisted in that program, meaning that they um, put the emblem on their dashboard and are, as part of their build process, are calculating their health score. A lot of the other ones, it seems to be off the radar.
So I
Um,
will say it is required for CNCF projects to use that. So
mhm.
all CNCF projects should have that. Um, yeah.
Yeah, maybe the ones that are, in the higher status levels, certainly it's pretty obvious that a lot of them that are in the lower ranks, sandbox, et cetera, do not appear, maybe
They
they have an aspirational goal of incorporating it, but they don't appear to have the stuff published on their GitHub page.
it's even sandbox projects, and the tags were commenting issues on every sandbox project to make
Okay.
sure that they were using it. But we might be talking about different things. The one I'm talking about is OpenSSF code best practices.
Okay. Yeah. That one, I think that one has always been there. And it's like I would call that even a one-time assessment. And this metric is something that is supposed to be rerun every time you do a build.
Mm.
And it's objective measurements as opposed to the other one. Some of those are actually more subjective. You know, what's your level of community engagement and things. That the last time I did it, I've done it for a few projects that I took into Sandbox or higher levels, but back when I was with VMware. And um, I don't think that the requirement was sort of the perpetual ongoing. This other one has kind of a formal engine that goes and crawls your GitHub stats to actually calculate these numbers, but you have to put the instrumentation in there to allow it to happen. And then you're supposed, it's optional to put the badge on your entry page and display the actual number that it computed. Um, and then there's a database on Google Big Data database where you're supposed to report the number so that someone could generate a graph over time from it. Anyway, I don't certainly, since many of the projects on that list, if not most, are not CNCF projects anyway. Um, the bulk of them don't have those metrics, but it is possible, provided they publish a GitHub repo, to go there and actually run the metric yourself. And I did that on a number of them, just seeing what happens. Got numbers and put them in the spreadsheet. The only thing that is a little bit complex is these projects that cross multiple repos. So particularly in that category where they're integrating projects that support plugins and things like that, they really sprawl across multiple repos. And without a detailed understanding of the project, um, it actually, my conclusion was that it would be moderately difficult to put that together. And if you were going to bother, you might as well do it formally, do the work, and submit it as a PR to the project. And then, yeah, have it provided the project then accepted it and took it on, you'd be done. But, it isn't even as simple as taking every repo under some kind of umbrella, because some of these projects have deprecated trees where they started out doing something one way and then walked away from it. I see Rob joined us, and Rob, we were just talking about coming up with a plan for going forward this year. And Kate brought up the idea that we might want to invest in um, that list of open source edge and IoT projects and turning that into in the long run, a landscape kind of along the lines of the CNCF landscape, where we would categorize things and have perhaps a more useful form than just a monolithic spreadsheet. Kate, you have your hand raised, so I'll stop
Yeah,
talking.
I think we just jumped in because it was just Steve and I at the start, but normally we like check if there's new people joining the meetings, and I haven't seen your name before, Gurov, so I just wanted to say hi. And if this is one of your first meetings, welcome, and feel free to add an agenda item or chime in with any questions. We're kind of starting off the year with some planning, so new thoughts and new ideas are always helpful.
Hi, this is actually my first meeting, and I'm very new to the whole space. I've been following your work specifically and Fermion's because I'm very much interested in Rust and WebAssembly. Actually, saw a tweet from CNCF group that there will be now internships open. That's why I had questions regarding that, but I can go at the end.
Well, I'm happy to, talk a little bit about that and we can circle back to the other stuff. I'm not familiar with the internship process for the CNCF. But I will also say that there is a WebAssembly working group. So the way the CNCF works is that there's the technical oversight committee,
Yep.
and then under them there's a bunch of technical advisory groups that are split into different areas of technology. So there's the runtime tag, focuses on all things runtime, which we fall under that. So edge environments, containers, and WebAssembly also has a working group. And so I would say, like, for diving deeper into the internals of WebAssembly within the CNCF, the WebAssembly working group is also a great resource. Though we do talk a lot about WebAssembly in this working group as well, in part because it's so common on the edge and in IoT spaces.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. And I also have not met Mahir before, but you do not have to go on camera or introduce yourself if you're not
Yeah,
comfortable
that's
with it.
cool.
Okay. Well, I think feel free to throw out specific questions as we go along, but I think we can circle back to discussing kind of the classifying edge projects. And yeah, Rob, I brought it back up because I wanted to see how we should go about like consistently working on that, and whether we should like formalize it as an objective for the working group, and the best way to do that.
I'm totally in favor of that. The challenge I have is just making sure that I set aside some time to keep the ball rolling. And sometimes this time slot is difficult for me personally to attend. But if we wanted to do a breakout session, I'd be willing to do that.
Yeah, I think we can always do one-offs, and I think this also is pretty this work might be doable asynchronously. I think it's more establishing process that we might want to do synchronously. So is this something where every meeting we review the spreadsheet and, you know, assign people 10 projects to categorize, or and what is our ultimate goal of the project? Is it to have a finalized spreadsheet we can share, or is it to have like a different visualization tool? And what does keeping it up to date look like, and so on? And what is the category of projects that we funnel in? So I know we've mentioned LF, I know we've mentioned CNCF, or like LF Edge, CNCF. And are there ones that don't fit? I think it would be helpful to know where they're all being pulled in from so that we can continue to pull in new ones from those organizations.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I think when I recall the conversation last time, one of the criteria we talked about was, should the list only be open source projects? And we might want to, if we decide that's a constraint, then we just probably want to write down those constraints somewhere so that we can stick to them as we continue the work.
That honestly seems like a good next step, is to define the goals of this project, like write down the constraints, write down what we want, almost like a spec for it. Like, what are the what categories and constraints, open source or not, like you were mentioning, and just document that, and so that we can all make sure we're aligned on that.
Steve, not to put you on the spot, but I think you may have been the person that's suggested open source as a requirement. Did you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. Part of the reason is that we do operate under the charter of the CNCF, and they do have a requirement that the group sponsored activity be focused on open source, or at least, maybe it's flexible enough that commercial things that incorporate open source are within the scope. But it sometimes becomes controversial at the borderlines of commercial open, and at times historically even even areas where open source licenses become involved, where you've had certain projects that started out with an open source license and then changed the license. The CNCF has a particular list of specific licenses that they consider open source. In other words, there have been companies that might invent their own license and put the word open source in there, but have sufficient restrictions that many people consider it debatable as to whether they actually are open source. I think that if we unleash the floodgates and allowed literally anything in there, that the scope of this just becomes untenable. And I'm not sure that I can say from personal experience I've seen it, but I've definitely heard people in the open source community say that once you let the commercial foot come in the doorway, that you can't keep them out and they'll end up taking over. It's also hard when you get into the commercial source area to really validate claims and specs on things, because if it's open, it's sort of subject to community regulation where it's more than just opinion as to whether some feature is in there or not, because you can always look at the source code. But some of these commercial things, maybe there's no way to validate it unless somebody was to actually buy a product and, install it and use it. And I don't think we have the resource for that. So my own opinion is that the list should be open source. I may be a little flexible as to, what open source foundations or organizations are allowed and what licenses are allowed, but there should at least be some auspice of it being open source. Kate, I see your hand up.
Yeah, along those lines, another way of phrasing this is, do we only let in organizations or let in projects that are owned by foundations and open source organizations, which already seems to be the format of the document. And I think starting with a smaller scope, to Steve's point, is helpful, and we can always grow from beyond there. So maybe we start by defining what organizations we are assessing the projects of. Already in the document, we have CNCF, LF Edge, Open Infrastructure Foundation, Eclipse, Apache. Those seem like the main ones. And maybe we start by just defining what organizations, and then anytime someone tries to bring in more projects, we can just add in more foundations or reassess this. I see also Steve mentioned that some of this was discussed in a previous meeting on November 13th as well.
I think that might also help avoid us getting burned out from trying to take on too much, because if it's part of CNCF or the Linux Foundation, then we can start to use some of that tooling we talked about last time. We can do things like monitor the GitHub repo to see if there's been commits recently, and we can automate all of that. Whereas if it's more of a personal project, we may not be able to do that work, and we'd have to take more on.
Yeah, and I would even suggest, what if we took the project from start to finish just with CNCF projects and see what that looks like? Like, keep all of the spreadsheet where we have all the organizations, but kind of understand what we want the end product to be, or end project to be, just with CNCF projects, since we are CNCF. What do folks think about that?
I think maybe we should open it a little wider and take anything that's under the Linux Foundation umbrella, myself, and some of those overlap. So there are actually projects, there is a column in that spreadsheet for the sponsoring open source organization. But as it turns out, I remember adding a few of those where they actually are dual listed under a couple different organizations at once. So even the thought that there is one, as it turns out, may not be entirely enforceable. But we should certainly tabulate what foundation, if any, is behind a project. And I may be a little flexible, because I think one of the stated goals of this group, or at least it was back in the days when we were under Kubernetes as opposed to CNCF, was that we'd potentially set ourselves up to allow a nascent incubating project to get publicity to build the traction so that they would be eligible to go into CNCF in a sandbox category. But I think that we potentially want to allow things that are just at the formational stages to get visibility, because if they don't get that visibility, they can't go anywhere. And I think one of the roles that this group could play is providing a forum where that could possibly happen. But the only way you can let it happen is to maybe be a little more inclusive on what's allowed to be in the list.
I agree that that is a great goal for the group to help build up visibility projects become sandbox. I mean, that was kind of the journey Aukrey went on, was presenting to this group to understand what it meant to be a part of the CNCF. And I would love to have that be a role the group continues to play. What
So
would that look
it
like for the spreadsheet? Would a project
Yeah.
submit to be entered into the spreadsheet? And maybe
Yeah.
that leads them to present to the working group?
Right. I think that when I first did that spreadsheet, I anticipated that, and you would just enter into the spreadsheet with the sponsoring foundation blank. And at least for somebody who's looking for a solution, the whole point of this, I think, and the point of the CNCF landscape is to help end users who have a problem and they're looking for a solution or a list of potential solutions to do an evaluation. And maybe they don't want to take anything that doesn't have a sponsor, but as long as we publish the information that would let them filter it, we still played a valuable role. And it could be that the fact that the foundation is blank is sort of a clue that this thing might be incubating. But I think there are actually some pretty sizable projects that they're out there standalone without a sponsoring open source organization as well. Those in that category, they might be more in the commercial things where whoever the commercial sponsor is fully committed to being open source, but they don't want to throw over the keys to the car to a foundation.
I would think that the Apache, Eclipse, Linux Foundation, CNCF, and Open Infrastructure would probably get us 90% of the projects that are out there. And maybe we could take the other 10% that you just described, Steve, as a case on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think
That
we're
could be.
also-
I think at this stage of the spreadsheet, though, we could be open, and like I say, the only thing that I would sort of be against would be full out commercial where they have no pretense of being open source at all.
Could we say that it has to be publicly available?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe just the minimum is there's a GitHub repository with the source code, regardless of license. But that may or may not be. I could be talked into even that. There aren't all that many of them that are a super restrictive commercial only license, yet they still publish the source code. I don't know for a fact that there are any of them in that list right now that are like that. Go, Kate.
I feel like we have two different objectives at play here. So I think one way to narrow down what our objective of this is to understand how people are interacting with this list. From what you were saying, Steve, it sounds like anyone can edit that list. Any community member could go in and edit the spreadsheet, which I think made sense when we were gathering all the projects, but I imagine the end result of this project is in an open spreadsheet. I imagine it being a different kind of interface. And I would have some concerns about just giving full public access to a curated list.
Right. Yeah, I think at the incubating stage, it made sense. And so far, as far as I can tell, we haven't had any problems. But if you look at the history of the CNCF landscape, I think it started up sort of open-ended, and now it runs with a PR process with, managers accepting and merging those PRs. And I think ultimately that's where it goes. But to get it close to that PR process, I think being more inclusive so that you can see what you've got on your hands and then categorize it. Maybe some next steps are even to figure out how many categories we've got. Break the things into those categories so that we could have a structure for something like the CNCF landscape where you're drawing pictures, in 2 dimensions with these categories and kind of project names and logos laid out. In order to even do that, you've got to categorize things. Maybe we should attempt to learn from the CNCF landscape, because there has been criticism of that CNCF landscape. The most common one is calling the thing an eye chart, where it might be a good problem to have, but it is so big and inclusive now that if you print the thing out, it's pretty much unusable, because the thing is just so massive that if you print it out on one page, you're gonna have to look at it with a microscope.
Yeah, I think my concern with the CNCF landscape is kind of something you alluded to earlier, Steve, about how it shoeholes projects into one category. I think we could do something different there, where we allow projects to be tagged and have multiple tags, and then you can filter by tag. And in the future, you could even have a dichotomous key where you could be like, I want this, and then that narrows down the set, and then you can say, I want this now, and ultimately you arrive at the project you need, or something like that. But in the minimum, I think allowing projects to have more than one category would be a gold star I'd like to work towards, like a goal that I see for the project.
Yeah, it could be that the CNCF landscape, I think, started out with the premise that, it's one 2-dimensional X by Y chart. And maybe ultimately that didn't work out. Maybe we just start with a chart per category and see if that comes out better. Now, in order to do that, we have to come up with the categories, but I'm just kind of freeform brainstorming here of what categories would be. But if you had categories of, I don't know, digital twin, firmware management, orchestration, secret management, those maybe OCI registries. If we came up with a page and allow these projects to be put on those pages, that might be workable. And then we may find that some projects, we'd have a dozen of these pages, but some projects actually have landed spots on multiple pages. I don't know, like I say, I'm just brainstorming, but any thoughts on that idea of approaching this?
I like the idea of categorizing it. The thing I think would be useful is if someone is trying to implement a certain use case or using a certain technology, you might want to be able to know what projects are relevant to your use case or the technologies you're already using. So having some connection between the projects there could be useful. So you talked about being in different categories. There could be, I think we talked about tags before when Kate was showing Notion. We might have a Kubernetes tag for this works specifically with Kubernetes, or a tag that says, okay, this is really focused on smart home use cases. So something like Home Assistant I saw on the list, or some of the LF Edge projects that are more smart home oriented would have a tag so that you know to look at related projects.
Some of these are potentially complex too when you've got a problem you're going to try to solve. And let me just give a tangible example of data communications to edge. That would be a more enormously broad category, but somebody looking for a solution might not need all the bells and whistles with that. They might not need full bi-directional communication, for example. They may prefer to have something that's more unidirectional, like sensor data collection on an intermittent basis, where MQTT would be a decent solution. Yet others might want full support of a flexible universe of containers, so that they'd want something more like a full service mesh. If the category started out as just data communication, it's almost too broad to be useful to many. But if you fragment that down to all the permutations of that, then just this data communication category becomes maybe a little too complex and hard to manage.
I think that's an important point. To oversimplify the point you're making, like some people just want an MQTT client for their fish tank, whereas other people want a resilient network to manage a whole infrastructure of 5G nodes, right?
Right. The other thing I could see is the moment we go into categories, I think you run the risk of kind of crossing categories based on what kind of problem you're trying to solve or what kind of function you're trying to get versus technology. Like I could see somebody suggesting, let's have a WebAssembly category. Well, to me, WebAssembly as a category, it might be a valid idea, but really it's a technology that can solve many problems. You know, just saying something has some aspect of WebAssembly doesn't tell me enough about it to tell me, you know, what problem does this project solve? So what are your thoughts on whether breaking these down with tags or categories based on the technology used is a valid thing we should do, or is it something that we shouldn't do?
I think that's tricky. I agree that we should not say every WebAssembly project fits in this spreadsheet. I think that's a problem. People conglomerating Blossom to the edge. It is, like you say, it's like a technology, just like you wouldn't say all projects that use containers go on the edge. So I think those low level, like isolation mechanisms, should not be a category, but potentially, I mean, this is the thing, is they could be, like, maybe that's an informational tag rather than a categorization tag. So maybe someone decides, I want to use something in this category. And then I also want it to happen to use this technology.
Right. I
So
think you're perfectly right that it's very useful, because just tagging it as WebAssembly would tell you it's very portable, you know, which, yeah, in the cloud native aspect where implement something once, have it run everywhere, it's something you'd want to know. But maybe it's orthogonal to this other categorization, which is based on, you know, what kind of job the project tries to take on.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between something that manages containers versus something that's delivered in containers. So there might be some ambiguity with certain tags. What does it mean if it's tagged with container?
Yeah, I agree. So I think what we're getting at is we have to be careful of creating category pigeonholes based on simply technology used. They really should be more focused on what kind of problem the project solves or what kind of role it attempts to take on, rather than implementation details, if you will.
Agreed.
Maybe a next step is to come up with a list of categories, and I'd suggest maybe as kind of recording something for discussion. If we wanted to put it in the spreadsheet itself, someone could add a new tab that is just a list of categories, and we could just have people start throwing suggested categories in there and have a meeting where we winnow that down, or, you know, try to discuss whether some of them are really needed or some categories maybe are overlapped and better combined. But first step might be just getting a perspective list of what our choices are on these categories.
I'm still thinking through this thought that if we came up with a whole list of potential categories, I think the next thing we'd want to try to do is see if they're relevant to the things in the list. So do we perhaps want to just create a new column on the existing spreadsheet and write down whatever tags we think relate to that project, so that later on we can go through and see how those tags compare to the things already in the list?
Yeah, that sounds like a workable approach to me.
Will you restate that? Sorry, I was in a conversation in the chat here. What is our next step that you mentioned, Rob?
Well, we could either try to come up with a list of tags on a separate spreadsheet, and then we could try to see if they relate to the projects already in the spreadsheet. Or we could just try to come up with tags for the projects that are already in the list. And then based on how often a tag gets used or how much overlap there is, we could decide which tags to choose based on how they represent the things in the list. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the thing that we ran into previously is how do we put multiple tags in one column, and we don't have like a Excel expert who's figured that out for us, I think. To do the experimental part. We've just been doing commas, but so we can't like filter for what's been put. But maybe that's.
I think commas will work for now, but I don't know. I've done it before. I'd have to look up how it's done, but I think the approach you do take in those Google Sheets is you go up to the column heading and there's a way you classify it and you can make it a list of choices. It makes it a little tougher to add a new one, but because, if some project got added there that was the first one in its category, it's not obvious that you might have to go to the top of the header, choose what is valid in the drop-down list, add an element to the drop-down list, and then you can tag each individual cell as allowing that list. And one of the complexities I remember, I did this once for something, but the default is that if you create one of those lists, you have to choose only one of them. And I think it was really difficult to allow multiple selection on those, but there's some way to do it.
So, for tags, then are categories and tags the same thing? Are we saying?
I guess we want to decide if we want to put things in one category or have the ability to put multiple tags on any one item.
Yeah, I think it's a given we need to be able to multi-tag items.
Right. I guess I was trying to categorize tags as some tags are technological tags and others are thematic tags. So like WASM versus edge orchestration.
Yeah, I think if we were to keep it, so long as we keep it in spreadsheet form, I think it's best to have two columns, one for functional categories and a second for technology categories, rather than conflating the two and combining them. But it's just my thought.
What are y'all's thoughts on us creating a document that discusses this project and defines some of these ideas? So like a document that says this is the spreadsheet. Right now we're creating tags. Tags could be functional or they could be technological. We're pulling in projects from these organizations. Later on, we intend to offer that to expand as a form of discovery for projects. Like, I feel like writing this down in a document we can all reference, because a lot of times when we talk about this project, I feel like we're constantly recatching ourselves up.
I think that's an excellent idea.
Okay,
I think
I
it would
can.
also help us when someone from one of these projects comes across this, if they feel compelled to update their entry, it also might provide them with a way of knowing who to contact. Are we open to other people updating things? How do they proceed? I think it would help spread the work.
Yeah, I feel like what we could do is create either one of we could create a Google Doc where we start this, or I can create a PR into the runtime tag GitHub page where we discuss this. Like, this is an objective of the working group. This is how you like add your project. We're still figuring out tags and categorization. Which one do we feel ready for? I think if we put it in the runtime tag, GitHub will get more visibility on this project. But we also, I don't think we're gonna get flooded with people if we do that. It's just more, are we ready to like, can we could try that? I could try to write something into the runtime
Yeah.
tag and see if we all align. But a Google Doc is if we still need alignment on what our goals are.
Yeah. I like the Google Doc and I suggest a way to do it. I put an example in the chat just now, but the history of this list is that this was based on discussion in meetings going back quite some time. Like the one I just cut and paste, let me see, that's from 2023. So I think that if you were to start a Google Doc, rather than just freeform start writing things, I think if you just search our historical agenda notes document for, I don't know, the list spreadsheet or something, you would be able to cut and paste a lot of discussion that we've already gone through. That was the oldest one I found that I just put in the chat, but there's many more like it. And uh, maybe just slam that into a Google Doc and you'd have a, a lot of useful information and discussion that's already occurred on what should get included and not, etc. You could even put that in the doc and put a title of history, just, so that we document the background. And our goal would be that this we start with that and then end up with a document that is a little more concise, like a single pager of everything you want to know about what the goals are for this and what the rules are for this list we're composing.
I think this gets to a preference of organizational patterns. For me personally, I'd rather attempt to write a mission document that's concise and people can reference the working group notes and their own personal memories of conversations in order to recommend edits to it. I think taking the time and effort to consolidate opinions that have flown reformed over time and just copy and paste them, to me, doesn't seem as useful as allowing people to like control F this themselves and look up the history of the conversation. And instead just based on where we're at now and then evolve that document beyond that.
Well, okay, if you want to go with that approach, I'm okay with it. So Gaurav, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I actually, if I'm following the conversation, so you wanted to tag the projects in the sheet with multiple tags, right? It could be in fitting different tags. and you wanted to, instead of having a comma separated thing, you wanted to actually have tags, multi-select. I think I can help with that. I just ran into a Google Sheet and I tried it and it worked. So I think I can help with that part.
That would be awesome. You should have access to the Google Sheet that we put in the chat here. Feel
Okay.
free to, it's the related principal columns. Column is the one where we already tried to start doing that with commas. But if that's overwhelming, you could even add a new column that's like tags, and make up a few fake ones or whatever,
Sure.
and use that as kind of the structure for us. But yeah, that'd be helpful. I don't personally spend much time in spreadsheet land.
That's cool. I see this is at scale management. These are borrowed from the principles tab that we have at bottom. They all map to the principles that are listed in the third sheet.
They should. I think there are some that are unique, like row 26 seems, maybe row 26 needs to just that needs to be rewritten, but
Okay, I can use the principles as the starting template and I'll add a few and we can shape it as we want going forward in future.
perfect, thanks.
Cool. Sure.
I can take an action item of trying to write up some of our goals for this project and create a document. But also happy to let someone else take that on. I know I haven't always been a part of this discussion, so if Steve or Rob, y'all feel like you want it, are better set to do that or want to do that, that is also okay.
Yeah, I'm okay with you doing it.
So I have a New Year's resolution to try to use ChatGPT more. I just dumped our notes into ChatGPT and asked it to summarize. It may have just done our work for us. Are you interested in seeing?
Yeah,
For
I am.
sure.
I'm really curious.
Do you want to paste it in the notes themselves so the format's probably not as weird?
Sure. Well, what if I'll put the I'll share the link to ChatGPT right in the notes in the chat section here so
Okay.
that you get the real formatting, but I'll share my screen. So all I did was take the Google Doc and save as a text file and then upload it. And first it tried to summarize all of our discussions, but then I asked it to provide a list of projects listed in the notes. And this is what it came up with. So like Edge projects and tools, WebAssembly tools, AI and ML for Edge, orchestration and infrastructure tools, security and SBOM, and then other open source initiatives.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. That certainly is I don't know if it's perfect, but it's a good first pass that would have taken me a bunch of time to come up with something maybe not quite as good.
I think it certainly shows the power of ChatGPT. I think we're really only interested in the Edge projects and tools part, but it already starts to discuss how certain things like the WebAssembly tools, all of those might not have a place in our spreadsheet because none of those are Edge specific.
But as a starting point for perspective tags, I think this looks it looks nice. Once again, historically, one of the reasons why there might be kind of these open-ended things that aren't edge specific in the list is that we left this open to the public for self-nomination. So anybody who wanted to put something in there could. And some of these categories, I don't know, in a way they're open-ended, but I think maybe they still belong in the list. Like as an example of that, let's take MQTT. Technically, you can use MQTT open-ended, generic, using it for full out public cloud only IT-centric projects that have nothing to do with edge. Yet realistically, I conjecture that 90% of the users are using those for edge use cases. So do those belong or not? I don't think you can eliminate something just because it's open-ended and potentially usable in a non-edge use case.
I know we're about to run out of time, but I just quickly downloaded the spreadsheet and tried to get ChatGPT to do my homework with it. So it's been uploaded and it's told me the columns and it's going through and just trying to do the work.
Well, I like the idea of getting ChatGPT to do anything useful we can. So I think you're onto something here, Ron.
And like you said, it may be wrong, but at least it's a good starting point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd love to see how this one turns out too.
How about if we leave this to you to report back? Because I don't think this is something that maybe it won't finish during this meeting. But if you had the resolution to go utilize it, it sounds like maybe investing a few more minutes in this would be something that would align with your resolution anyway.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that on. I think Gaurav has his hand.
I actually don't have edit access either through the sheet or the doc, so I've sent a request.
Yeah, what you have to do is this group has a membership list,
Okay.
which is just joining a Google group. And then if you're logged into Google using exactly the same email that you are logged in when you try to open those documents, then you'll get in. So we're not maintaining a list of individual names. It's simply
Got it.
tied to the group membership.
I see.
Um,
Thank you.
do you know enough to join that membership list?
I'm new here, so I don't know.
Okay, just a minute. Let me see if I can
If
cut and
you
paste
click on
that.
this link here that I put in chat, that should take you to a Google group.
Yep, I
And
see
if
the group.
you have a Google account or a Gmail or something, you should be able to join that group. And then once you've joined that group, you can access these files.
Okay, I just joined and I should be able to access now. Yep, I see. I think I can edit now. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Awesome. That was quick. Thank you. So I'm finalizing some action items. I have me try to write a document that summarizes the spreadsheet project and its goals. Rob, try to use ChatGPT to improve the spreadsheet and tags. And then I have Gaurav to try to change the tags, create a tags column where we can choose many.
Yep.
Joel commented with a good idea to track this project. We should create an issue in runtime tag repo pointing to the doc. I think I'll do that once after our next meeting, once we all agree that I've summarized what the project is doing well. But yes, I think that is a great idea.
Okay, all of that sounds good. So we're almost to the top of the hour. Anything else before we disband and regroup over this at the next meeting?
Sounds good. Happy New Year to everyone. It was good to see you all again.
Okay, Happy New Year. Bye.
Pretty good. Bye.